That's one of those songs, it seems that whenever we sing it, you really hear it. Am I on? No? Yeah, there we are. It's one of those songs that when we sing it, you can really hear it coming from the congregation. And it's a great gospel truth too, isn't it? That we can really anchor our faith to. Well, in light of some of the readings that we had here, and I noticed too, sitting back there listening to Cheryl read, that when she said, "Lazarus, come out," some of you almost literally came out of your pew. so yeah, there was some expression there. But 2 weeks ago, I had attended a funeral. It was in Fort St. John. I was able to get up there, and I was there for about 2.5 days. And while I was there, there's those moments that you have. Sometimes you have this fear, some fear that kind of fills you, and it can, and just let me explain this. My last morning that I was there, it was a Friday morning, and I was able to get out on a morning hunt for moose with some of my. It was with two of the same old guys that I had gone out with hunting with regularly. Well, as regular as I went when we were living there. And these two guys are father and son, and they know the land so very, very well. They both, one is still an operator being he services and maintains oil and gas sites, about maybe 30 of them, something like that. And so he'll tour the countryside and check on those sites each day. And his son used to be into that too. And so in doing that and being native to that land, they would travel the same terrain, and it covered quite a span. And they knew that land well. They knew where the animals were. And it made, for me, that makes the hunting experience a whole lot better, because if I go with them, they're just going to drive right to where you need to go. And there isn't a whole lot of tromping through the bush that needs to take place. But the whole thing behind it too, and here's what I mean about fear, is that we would be driving on these old lease roads or these old goat roads. And the guy who did most of the driving, his driving really made me kind of nervous. It really did. He knew those trails, and he knew what was coming up around the next bend, whereas I did not. And I just couldn't sit in the back of the seat, in the back seat of the truck, I just couldn't sit there. I really would. I'm not good with motion sometimes, to the best of times, and I would be ready to get sick so quick. And so they would give me the passenger or the front seat, thinking that I was doing that to get the front seat. But even at that, I could barely hang on at times. And why? And I think this: if I were doing the driving, I think I'd be all right. I'd be all right. Like I say, if in the front seat as a passenger, I have a better chance. But I think what my issue really is not being in control in that moment. And just for interest's sake, I want to ask this question: does anyone here struggle with motion sickness when in a car? Yeah, a few of you do. Okay, now those of you who put your hand up, when you're behind the wheel, when you're doing the driving, do you still get motion sickness? No. So there's what I'm thinking, is that it's kind of that whole thing of having to be in control a little bit. And you know what? It's more than that too. It's more than not being in control. It's the uncertainty of it all that really gets us, I think. And it's the uncertainty in life that can really make someone feel anxious. It can be such a horrible feeling when you feel so uncertain. And there are so many things in life that can push us into the realm of uncertainty. There are so many things. And by no means is it limited to being a passenger in a vehicle. There's so much more. I put out a sign this past week. I don't know if some of you had read it on the way in, but it reads this: "Today is a gift from God. It's called the present." And I think we are robbed from truly living in the present for constantly thinking of the future. Specifically, being consumed by the anxiety and the worry over a future that really, frankly, we are unable to predict. And if we're all honest, there are more than a few things that are beyond our control. And there are a few things, if we want to be honest still, that frighten us. And death would be right among the top of the list of those things. And maybe some of you, or maybe even all of you, could say this. You're sitting in your pew, and you can say, I can say this: I am not afraid of dying, not at all. I know where I'm going. I know the promises of God. I believe the promises of God, and that my life after my time here on earth is entry into the awesomeness of glory, heaven, and I believe that, and that removes any fear of death from me. And you know, that could really be true. But you know what? It doesn't make death any less comfortable. Because probably this is also very true. We are more afraid of losing someone to death than we are of dying ourselves. I wonder if that would be true. Regardless, death is something that none of us, absolutely none of us, can avoid. And our days are numbered. We do not know what that number is, and death is going to find all of us in some way. And death isn't a friend. It's real and it's harsh. In John chapter 11, the story of Lazarus being raised back from life, or back to life from death by Jesus, and even in this story we see that death, it's real and it is harsh. And there is no resuscitation of Lazarus from the dead should sentimentalize that. I don't think that we should sentimentalize any facet of the claim that death has over any of us, because death, it does sting. It certainly stung the mourners in John chapter 11, didn't it? And the family and friends of Lazarus and his sister Mary. Well, she's so bothered by her brother's death, and verses 32 to 33 really capture her view and her indictment of the whole thing. And I'll read it again. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And it says Jesus was troubled. He was troubled by this whole life event that was taking place. And then only 2 verses later, we are told that Jesus himself had wept. It is the shortest verse in the Bible. And there have been several views that have been expressed over why Jesus was so troubled by this whole event, over why he had wept. And one was that he didn't weep so much because Lazarus had died, but he wept because of the lack of belief that those close to him actually had in him, that he was the Messiah, and what that meant, and that death was nothing to be afraid of. And this is true. He was the Messiah. And he was also, he performed miracles of all kinds. There was healings. He would, over nature, calm the seas, and there was exorcisms and so forth. And many of these miracles, they were doing that. They were confirming who he was. But for many, who he was confirmed at the resurrection when he rose from the grave. So was his weeping in John chapter 11 really over his friends and family, not fully understanding his identity as Son of God, as the Messiah? Maybe it was, or maybe there's another view. And here it is. Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit. He was greatly troubled. The connotation here being that there is a connection to anger. It's not simply a strong feeling, but it's more of a passion and pain that comes from anger at the situation. Jesus weeps. He has the same reaction here as the mourners do. He weeps real tears. And he was angry, and he was groaning deeply in his spirit, and he was stirred up in his mind and in his body and in his heart by Lazarus' death. And he cried out aloud. Personally, I'm comfortable with that second view. I don't think it's too hard to believe that even the incarnate God can be broken in his spirit and soul by the death of his friend Lazarus, and also by the grieving effect that it had on all of the mourners that were gathered outside Lazarus' tomb on that day. And it's within this context that we can tell the story of Lazarus, or Jesus offering life anew to Lazarus. And death stinks. And death stinks. Verse 39, and no amount of perfume or pat answers can change that from being true. And the miracle is that this man, this smelly dead man, comes walking out from the tomb at the simple command of Jesus to come out. And death for Lazarus is defeated. And he's going to need to clean up. He's going to need to take off the grave clothes, because Lazarus gets another chance at life here. However, death is not forever defeated for Lazarus. This is not the resurrection of Jesus. It is the temporary recovery from death for Lazarus. But in light of this story, what are we to say then? What are we to say in the midst of suffering and the reality of death? Well, I think it's okay to go through all of the feelings and the pain and the emotion in mourning and grieving, because I think that will make our faith declarative all the more sweet then. Because as believers in the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus, I think we are to proclaim the truth of the sting and stench of death. I think we're to acknowledge the grief and the anger that may never totally depart those that are still left in this life. I think we're to state the reality of the disturbing fact of the brutality of death, because the gospel truth does reign. We have our hope not on the things of this earth, but in the power of the cross and in the resurrection of those who are his children. John 11:25. The resounding gospel note that I want to proclaim this day is when Jesus says this: I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And personally, I find it moving, comforting and assuring in knowing that our God does grieve along with us over the things that disturb us, over the things that bring us pain. I find it deeply moving that God, in his Spirit, does grieve along with us. I find it all the more faith assuring that God despises all that death is. And I'm even all the more grateful that he has done something about it. I love the imagery of Isaiah 25 that Cheryl had read earlier too. The passage where the Lord is preparing this huge feast, this great feast at that sacred mountain. And all people, all kinds of people are gathered there. There are people that have been oppressed. And there's even the people that were the oppressors. They're all there at this table. And what we see here too is that the powerful, the lowly, the native, and the foreigner, they're there. And the part that I really like is that within these short few verses is how at this feast that has the choicest of meats and the finest of wines that are there, is that the Lord doesn't partake in any of those things. The people do, and they enjoy it all. But at this feast, what the imagery is that the Lord opens his mouth, and he swallows the covering, the shroud, all of the stuff that plagues people, all of the stuff that creates conflict and division and so forth. The veil that is over all the nations, all the confusion. And then finally, in verse 7, he swallows up death itself. And the context of this imagery is that to swallow is to consume completely, leaving no trace behind. It's gone. And so when the Lord consumes death, the implication is that death no longer has power or residence. And what God is saying through Isaiah years ago is that he makes possible a future for his people beyond death and destruction. And isn't this really what Revelation 21 was reiterating? I think it was. It's simply, Revelation 21 is a reassertion of old promises that say that death is not going to have a final say. Death will be and has been defeated. It's not going to have dominion over anyone who would look to God and say, you know what, not me. No, not me. I will not be beaten down. I will not be shaken. I will not be beaten or broken down in spirit, because I am a follower of God. I am a child of the risen Lord. And this is the day that the Lord has made. And I will rejoice. And I will be glad. And I will celebrate it. President Lyndon Johnson, he had a son by the name, I'm sure he did. But he had a nephew whose name was Randy Johnson. And he was an athlete, and it's not to be confused with the very tall baseball player. But he was a football player, and he earned a scholarship at Oklahoma State University. And Randy was an average college quarterback. There was nothing flashy about him or anything like that. And during his tenure with the team, and he played on a team that was fairly average, and some might even say they were mediocre. But in 1996, after a poor season, Randy and the team, they were in their final game of the season, last one, which would also be the last moments for some of the senior players who were playing on that team. That would be it. And they were down by 6 points, and it was within the very dying minutes of the game. And they had the ball on their very own 20-yard line, which would mean they'd have to march to 80 yards to get to the other side, a very large feat. And the field was muddy, and even the Oklahoma coach had kind of figured, we're not going to win this football game. And so what he did was he removed all of the starting, or nearly all anyway, of the starting players from the field and replaced them with the senior players, the senior students. It was kind of a showing of honor that he was giving to be able to finish their college careers on the field that had been their home for the last 4 years. And the coach sent in instructions with these players, these senior players going into the huddle. Tell Randy that he can call whatever play he wants to call here. It's up to him. And so that was the instruction that they gave him. And so Randy called play number 13. And play number 13 was a trick play. It was a play that they had never used in a game before. And why? Because they could never get it to work in practice. And so they tried it. And the impossible happens. And play 13 works. And Oklahoma State wins that game by a single point. The fans go wild. And Randy's carried off the field as the hero of the game. And afterward, this is the funniest thing. The coach asks him, goes up to Randy, and he says, Randy, what in the wide world made you call that play? And Randy answered, well, he's a senior himself. I don't know if he majored in math or the science world, but he said, we were in the huddle, and I looked over and I saw Harry with tears running down his face. It was going to be his last college game, and we were losing. And I saw that big old number 8 on his chest. And then I looked over and I saw Ralph, and the same thing. He's got tears running down his face. It's his last game as well. And I saw that big old number 7 on his jersey, and so in honor of those two heartbroken seniors, I added 8 and 7, and I called play 13. Coach looks at him and said, Randy, 8 and 17 doesn't add up to 13. Randy reflects for a moment and goes, you know what? You're right, and if I was as smart as you, we'd have lost this football game. You know, maybe sometimes maybe bad math is good math. But sometimes there is such an enormous weight that is on our shoulders, in our heart, because something has pushed us into that realm of uncertainty. And death will certainly do that. The pain of loss, it really hurts. And the older that we grow, the more aware we become of the reality of death. But today is a gift from God. And this is the day that the Lord has made. So let's rejoice and let's be glad in it. And God has promised. He's promised that He is making all things new. And the joy of the day isn't something that we have to wait for. The fullness of it may be. But the story of Lazarus tells us something. It tells us that we all have a second chance. And we are given another chance each day to give glory to our God and embrace the newness of a new day. To have the joy and peace of God that fills us up. And yet when we do the math sometimes, it just seems like that's impossible to have joy when troubled and stirred up so poorly in our spirit. But you know, what is faith? What is faith? Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. And why? Because Christ has conquered all. 1 Corinthians, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? And we bring it all back. Death will not have the final say. It doesn't have the final say, not in this life, and certainly not in the next. And today is another day. It's another day, another chance to live in the joy that our God grants to us. And you know what it's called? It's called present. Well, let's stand and let's sing together as we go to communion. And we're going to sing that song, Come to the Water, or For Those Tears I Die. And it's that song of, you know, when you listen to the lyrics of God inviting you to come walk with Him. And when we do that, we do experience and the joy of a new day. And so let's sing together.